Our text before the lesson is Proverbs 31, verses 10 through 31. Proverbs 31, 10 through 31. These are God's words. An excellent wife who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She is like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from afar. She rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household and portions for her maidens. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands she plants a vineyard. She dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hands to the distaff, and her hands hold the spindle. She opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household are clothed in scarlet. She makes bed coverings for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them. She delivers sashes to the merchant. Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household, and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful, and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. May God bless the reading and preaching of his word. Amen. Please be seated. In the creation account of Genesis 1 that was read to us earlier, God's delight in his ordering of the universe is expressed 7 times with the phrase, God saw that it was good. A revelation of divine pleasure that crescendos in the superlative very good at the completion of his task in verse 31. But in chapter 2, as the story is retold, we experience what Peter Leithart has called a startling decrescendo. When following the creation of Adam, the Lord God says in verse 18, "It is not good for the man to be alone." Now, I will admit that the Genesis 2 account of man's forging has always struck me as a bit strange, particularly the sequence of its events. I have wondered, why did God form Adam first in isolation as opposed to creating a complementary set of humans as he did with all of the other creatures? Meaning, if it's not good for man to be alone, as Leithart wonders, why leave him alone even for an instant? Why not mold a matching pair from the dust? So, of course, Adam is created first. That makes sense, but why not Eve immediately following that? Upon closer inspection, however, it becomes clear that this sequence is part of a broader creational pattern, where God begins his work with a deficiency or privation that is then brought to perfection through God's culminating actions. As that which is imperfect is perfected, and that which is partial is made whole. Just as the earth in the beginning, we are told, is formless and void and covered in darkness, God then brightens and shapes and fills it so that it shines with light and life. Similarly, the land that God creates as he pushes the seas back is initially barren, but he soon sends the rains to nourish it and mankind to nurture its potential. That's verse 5 of chapter 2. Therefore, what is initially created formless is given shape. That which is void is brought to abundance. That which is unfruitful reaches fecundity. And what God does on the cosmic level, he repeats on the microcosmic level. Peter Leithart put it this way: like the earth and the land, man begins in incompletion, analogous to a dark, formless, and empty earth, like a desert land without rain or vegetation. As God supplies what's lacking in creation's deficiency, so he rescues man from his solitude. By beginning with Adam in isolation, we learn a lot about the nature and purpose of both man and woman. That while Adam was designed to be king, the success of his reigning over the earth will be dependent upon having a fitting queen. That while he is to be the Lord's husbandman, the flourishing of his fields will rely upon him having a capable bride. That while Adam is to be the head of his wife, what good is a head without a body? It's no better than a body without a head. The point being, as Leithart notes, it's not that man is omnicompetent and then delegates to the woman for the sake of efficiency. On the contrary, man will only achieve what he has been mandated to achieve, which is to fill the earth, if the woman helps him, which is the essence of her function. She is to be a helper, the text says, formed as she was from the rib that was taken from Adam's side. And as many scholars have pointed out, the Hebrew word here for helper, ezer, does not relegate women to menial labor. She is not just the help, you might say. Indeed, it's not even a domestic term at all, but rather a political one, being used to describe the help that David's mighty men give to their king in 1 Chronicles 12, and that which Joshua renders to the city of Gibeon in Joshua 10, verse 6. Man's mandate is political. He is to subdue the earth and rule over it, to civilize the planet. And the reason it's not good for man to be alone is because apart from woman, he cannot complete his mission. For man and woman together form a household, from which the dominion mandate is to be fulfilled. The gift of the woman, then, transforms the man from a waterless waste into the human equivalent of the garden of God, as Leithart poetically puts it. For only with woman, I should say, can man, and I speak here in the aggregate, of course, but only with woman can man reach his full glory. For woman, as Paul says, is the glory of man. Now, we're given much insight into the form that this supporting role is to take in our text in Proverbs 31. As we've said previously, the book of Proverbs is written to princes, primarily the son of King Solomon. And it places before these young men two destinies from which they must choose. And those destinies are presented in the form of two brides. The worthy maiden, Lady Wisdom, the gain from whom is better than from silver and her profit better than gold, and then the worthless woman, Lady Folly, who will steal their honor and strength and lead them into the pit of Sheol. The question is, whom will they choose to make their queen? Will they be a Prince William, as I like to say, or a Prince Harry? Will they bring honor and glory to the crown, or exchange their power for a prostitute? Such is the choice, and indeed such is the choice of every young man in God's kingdom today, because in the wake of Pentecost, we are all princes now. The right answer, of course, comes at the end of the book, in Proverbs 31, in this celebration of the worthy woman. Again, verses 10 through 12. An excellent woman who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. Verse 12 there is a woman's mission statement, you might say. To do your husband good and not harm all the days of your life. The text then goes on to list the good that she does him, the gain that he will receive. Verse 13, she seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She is like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from afar. She rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household and portions for her maidens. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hand she plants a vineyard. She dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hands to the distaff, and her hands hold the spindle. She opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. So wholesome food, industry, charity, renown is what a worthy wife brings to her husband. A woman of virtue who rises early, works hard, and displays great competence and wisdom, who not only considers a field and buys it, but makes it fruitful through the work of her hands. And such worth leads then to her praising. Verses 28 and 29. Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. The wife, it says in Proverbs 12:4, is the crown of her husband. If a man chooses Lady Wisdom to be his bride, his diadem will shine brightly as he sits in the gates among the elders of the city. She will be a blessing to him all of the days of his life. He will have no end of gain. But if he weds himself to the harlot, he will only bring cursing upon his household. And so the exhortation of Proverbs 31 is directed first and foremost to young men, princes in the Lord's kingdom who are readying themselves to rule and who are in need of a bride to help them fulfill their royal vocation. But it also provides us with a glimpse into the supporting role a godly wife is to play in fulfilling her husband's mission concerning her duties in his household, which up until the Industrial Revolution, as we mentioned last week, was the economic seat of civilization. The household was. Where it was a time when work was not a father's sole responsibility, where he would leave the house and go off and work, but rather it was about a family industry, a domestic economy that would include not only the father, mother, and their children, but extended family members, apprentices, slaves, hired hands, and others. And often the house itself would be divided into living quarters on one end and offices, workshops, and stores on the other. And this was true whether you lived in cities or in more rural areas. And the work of women, really for, at least in the civilized world, up until modernity, was very much that of the Proverbs 31 woman, as scholars note, because wives were intimately involved in the household production, undertaking a broad range of tasks, including child rearing, cooking, tending livestock, gardening, fetching water, garment making, soap and candle production, beekeeping, spinning, brewing, preserving and trading produce at the market and other forms of industry, just as we read in Proverbs 31. In other words, these women demonstrated great competence. They had mastered many skills that were not just essential to survive, but in order to thrive. And because of this, wives often exercised a great deal of delegated authority in the household. Indeed, they often acted as the mistress of the household, is the terminology that was often used, at least in the 18th and 19th century, where they would manage their servants and among the upper classes would even host events on their husband's behalf. And women would also run the family business when their husbands were traveling or under the weather. And because of this, traditional women were often given great deference and respect, for it was believed that the appearance and dignity of the wife confirmed the status of the husband, as one scholar put it. In other words, a husband's wife was thought to be his glory, to be his crown. And thus, a woman's role in traditional society in many ways presented the inverse of her role now, of her role in modernity. Traditional cultures have long had the reputation of marginalizing women, of relegating them to menial domestic tasks. But the opposite is actually the case. It was with industrialization that women went from being full participants in a bustling household economy in which they exercised authority over children and servants and laborers, to being isolated in their homes, left with only the most marginal of domestic tasks. Especially once technology replaced the need to spend one's day on the necessities of life like cooking and washing and fetching water. Even child rearing was soon industrialized through the public school system, and that was because they needed to create proper workers to work in the factories. The origin of the Bell schedule, right, is because they wanted to introduce students to the efficiency of the factory. That's why there were bells. In other words, every one of you has been trained by a system that was designed, likely all of you, not you younger kids that are homeschooled and other Christian education, but us older people were all trained to be workers in a factory. That was the system. This is why when modern Christian women read Proverbs 31, they have a hard time relating to it, because other than providing general moral instruction about hard work and sacrifice, this excellent wife performs tasks that have been largely outsourced to industry. However, this did free up women to perform the most important task of all in an industrial economy, which is shopping. The worthy woman, we might say, rises while it is yet night on Black Friday to secure a Tory Butch tote bag, right? The Proverbs 31, the modern translation. She considers the Zule Kitchen handheld milk frother and buys it, providing effervescent caramel lattes for her household. Doesn't quite work. Now, of course, the idea of women shopping all day was more true in the mid-20th century, when most male wage earners could keep up with consumer demand, and by that I mean the demands on us to consume. But this is no longer the case, and a second income is usually required, meaning that women had to go to work. Now this turning, just as an aside, this turning of women into mass consumers was not by accident, because mass consumption is needed to feed industrialization, which creates, as one writer put it, a feedback loop where increased production leads to more consumption, which leads to more production. Our entire economy now is based upon ever-increasing mass consumption, requiring what Mary Harrington has called an escalator of desires, where people are perpetually provoked into desiring more and more products. In other words, an industrial economy like ours must not only manufacture goods and services, but the desire to buy those goods and services. That's what's known as marketing. A manipulation that can often be quite subtle, like when the medical industrial complex, in order to produce obscene profits, manufactures widespread fear by creating health crises. This isolation of women to the now privatized domestic sphere was ennobled by the influential Enlightenment philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whom C.S. Lewis, by the way, referred to as the father of all tyrants. And the historian Glenn Sunshine once said, it's quite humorous, he said that if he had a revolver with 2 bullets in it, and he was in a room with Hitler and Rousseau, he'd shoot Rousseau twice. He is a villain of history. But in Rousseau's view, and this is a quote, the true mother, far from being a woman of the world, is as much a recluse in her home as the nun in her cloister. A woman's place was in her home, according to Rousseau, isolated from the rest of the world. In fact, he thought it indecent for husbands to even know what's going on in the home, because that was a woman's domain, and women should in turn not involve themselves with the outside world. All of this to say that the disembedding of market production from domestic life, which occurred during the Industrial Revolution, led to the husband being separated from his home, as we noted last week, and the wife being separated from society, as we're talking about now, but also husbands and wives being separated from each other. A kind of triple isolation that worked to destroy not only the productivity of the household in fulfilling the cultural mandate, but in turn it destroyed the souls of both men and women. Having lost their purpose, they began experiencing a meaning crisis. The regulating of men to the dog-eat-dog world of corporate industry, as we discussed a little last week, led to much character deformation, which produced widespread alcoholism, adultery, misogyny, the kind of men you see portrayed in the television series Mad Men. Or if we think of a more recent example in late modernity, it's a sort of a more isolated version of this man. You could find it in the movie Fight Club. All of which demonstrates that it's not good for the man to be alone. But here's the thing, it's also not good for a woman to be alone. Women were designed to participate alongside their husbands in the household economy, not to be cloistered from society, but to productively participate in it, not by abandoning their household, but by using their household as the hub of industry. Indeed, the rise of the women's movement, the desire for women to participate in the now industrialized society, was fueled, at least in part, by this isolationism. But in pursuing the wrong outlet for it, women then said, well, we'll just join the workforce as independent wage earners and act just like men. That has brought ruin to what is left of the household, what we call the nuclear family. So we lost the household as the Industrial Revolution began, and now we are losing its nucleus. So we've gone from where everybody was at home to now nobody being at home, not even the children. And now we are losing marriage itself. Because what purpose does it serve, marriage, other than to provide companionship, which one can find in other less restrictive relationships, especially now online? Industrialization is also isolating husbands from their wives, as I said. Apart from his wife, man cannot complete his mission. For man and wife together form a household from which the dominion mandate is to be fulfilled. Separated from his wife, man becomes, as Lightheart said, a waterless waste, instead of the human equivalent of the garden of God. And we can just look at this shrinking birth rate in the West as evidence of this. We have abandoned the fertility mandate. We are massively off mission. And by the way, this is the same divide and conquer strategy that Satan used in Genesis 3. Our arch enemy wants to delay the enculturation of our world, which means that he must destroy the household. And to do that, most fundamentally, he must separate husbands and wives. And to do that, what he has done is separated household from industry, forcing men to leave and women to be left at home alone. Now, there's a lot more, of course, that could be said. This story has many subplots, but let me mention one last aside. Feminists have long complained that in traditional societies, women were dependent upon their husbands for their survival, because only men could own land and vote and all the rest. But in seeking their independence in the modern world, they have simply shifted that dependence to industry. Women, as the weaker vessel, are going to be dependent upon someone. That is a law of nature that cannot be violated. It will either be their husbands or the heads of giant corporations or the government. And so I ask you, which of those two would you choose, right? Do you want to be the crown of your husband who loves you, or do you want to be the crown of what is essentially a pimp, someone who's going to use you and turn you into a mass consumer, a slave? Which, by the way, demonstrates how important it is when it comes to choosing a husband. You are putting your life in this person's hands, your well-being, spiritual and physical, and all of your children's as well. Generations will be affected by the choice you make. Now, the question of how women can re-embody the role of the Proverbs 31 woman, given our present political and economic system, is a challenging one. And one that there are no easy answers to. It's not as simple as just going back to the colonial period, which, by the way, had its own issues, and then bringing that into our present context. That won't work. We will need to engage in what we called last time resourcement, which is going back and taking the things that are noble and good and then trying in our current system to find a way to make them work, and also to set up institutions and households that can withstand, if it is true that our nation will unravel, households that can withstand that and then can reseed the earth, can replant the civilization. And that's what C.R. Wiley, in his book that we are reading both in the men's and women's classes, is talking about. And this lesson and the lesson last week is, as I said last week, is providing context for that particular study. I'll leave you with this. It's a word of warning. Our desire for the traditional household makes us susceptible to marketeers, to a Christianized escalator of desires. The sort of the trad life or the traditional life, TM, trademarked. That which is sold by corporations such as Chip and Joanna Gaines, Inc., or Ballerina Farms, Inc. A safe version for us to inhabit, to appease us, safe from the point of view of the marketers. For as long as we are mass consuming what they produce, they don't care what it is that we consume. And then the matrix just goes on. So regardless of what path we take, we must restore the household. And I believe we must bring industry. In order to do that, we have to bring industry back to the home somehow. And of course, husbands and wives have to be brought back together, because that is the path to flourishing.